last video on code generation. I'll show you a number of tricks here. I've slightly changed the model. This doesn't really make a difference, but I went back to the array just to make it more readable. And I also added a method here that will demonstrate certain things. But I'll start off with something different. As you might have noticed before, whenever I add something to the diagram, for example a class, it ends up being in the top level of my model. And because I want to have everything for code generation in this package here, it's not that ideal, and sometimes I forget things and so on. So I would like to change that. And to do so, I click on my diagram and I change the root element. So this is basically where everything is located. And if I change it to Chalmers, nothing really happens to the things that are already there. But now if I add another class, it should also show up in that package. So now you see that class 1 is actually here, and this is exactly what I would like to have. So this is a small detail, but it can be rather annoying if you don't change this, because, for example, your relations end up outside and you forget moving them in there and so on. So that's number one. Now we go next into something that is called incremental code generation. So I added this little method here, and let's just regenerate to make sure everything is up to date. So now, for example, I also have class 1. But if I go into the patient record, you will see that here I have a method. And of course, sooner or later, I will start implementing. So for example, I just add a little print here. Nothing special. But now I go back to my model and I would like to add something. For example, I figure out, well, my patient also needs some kind of method. Let's add it. And now I generate again. And now suddenly my code is gone, even though it's in a different class and so on. And the reason for this is that Papyrus Designer just generates a batch. It just regenerates everything and it overwrites everything that you have. And that is slightly annoying, because in most cases you will have an iterative approach of generating, writing code, adding something else and so on. And that's why we need incremental code generation. To enable that, you go to your project and you go back to the profile view and you go down to the project stereotype, and here you see the generation mode. That one you can set to incremental, and then in theory this should work. The issue now is you should be careful, because this is rather experimental still, so always make a backup before you do things. Plus, code generation is always a bit tricky with removing things, so there might be, even though you might have removed something in here, it might still be there and so on. So you always have to check what your result of the generation was. But anyway, let's say I add my code again. I save and I change something to my diagram. For example, I add an operation here. I remove this operation, which will probably show you that it's still there, we'll see. And I regenerate. Now in incremental mode. And the important thing, if I go to patient record, you will see that this is still there. The other thing you see is that you have this little star here. So actually, the whole history of doing this generation is saved. So if you go back, you see what actually happens. It kind of does some duplication of the code. And I actually don't know how the mechanism works in detail. But at least our code is still there. And also, if you go to class 1, you see that the method has been added. Now my suspicion is if you go to patient, the operation is still there, because removing is a bit tricky, so I might have to change this by hand. And this has a lot to do with how this is implemented in practice. So as you see, this might be complex. Always do backups. The last thing I'll show you is probably a bug. We'll see whether I can reproduce it. Just so that you are aware of it. So let's put an association between my two classes, and let's make them, for example, 1 to 1, and they should be bidirectional, so both ends are navigable. So now patient should get an attribute class 1, and class 1 should get an attribute patient. Let's try this. Class 1 has a patient, great, and patient has class 1. So far everything is good. Now I'll change something in my model. For example, I add an operation down here and I regenerate the whole thing. Now this seemed to work. That's great. Let's do another round. Okay, in this case I don't get any issues. What I have seen sometimes is that this attribute gets duplicated. So suddenly you have another one here. I haven't really found the issue for that yet, but it's good to be aware that this might happen. So just in case you get errors, it might be related to that. But today I'm lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, and it didn't work. And there might, of course, be other issues that I haven't yet discovered that you will find throughout the work with it. Let me know and I can update the videos.